All right, get ready because today we're diving deep into functionalism
Oh, functionalism.
in the philosophy of mind. Yeah.
Okay.
We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on functionalism.
Sounds dense.
It's going to be a good one.
All right.
So, have you ever wondered what makes a thought your thought or how feelings even work?
Oh, all the time. Definitely.
Today we're going to unpack that.
Looking forward to it.
So basically, functionalism says it's not about the physical stuff of your brain, but about how those bits work together.
Yeah.
It's like saying a heart is a heart because it pumps blood no matter what it's made of.
Right, exactly.
Like it could be made of, flesh
Yeah.
or Martian goo.
Martian goo, exactly.
It's still a heart.
It's about what it does, right. It's about the function.
Yeah, yeah.
So just like a clock can be made of gears, or you can have a digital clock, or even a water clock, right?
Oh,
You
interesting.
can have all these different ways of making a clock. But what makes it a clock is that it tells time.
Yeah, yeah.
And functionalism says that mental states could be realized, that's the term they use,
Right.
by different physical mechanisms, maybe even non-physical mechanisms,
Bro, okay.
as long as they're performing the same function.
So you're saying my thoughts could, theoretically exist on a giant computer made of potatoes?
Well,
That's wild.
I mean, maybe not potatoes, but the idea is that it's not about the material.
Yeah, yeah.
It's about the organization. It's about the function.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the potato computer is a bit of a stretch,
Right.
but it gets at the core idea.
I see. So it could be anything, really,
In theory, yeah.
as long as it's doing the thought thing.
Exactly.
So the article, it mentions some early roots of this idea, in Aristotle,
Yeah.
his theories of the soul,
Interesting.
and Hobbes,
Okay.
his idea about the mind as a calculating machine.
So we're going way back.
Yeah.
Well, it's important to remember that when they talked about the soul, it wasn't quite the same as what we might think of today.
Right.
It was more about the animating principle of a living thing.
Like what made it alive?
Yeah, what gave it its specific form and function.
Okay.
But even back then, you see this focus on what a thing does rather than what it's made of.
Interesting.
So, in a way, they were already kind of hinting at this functionalist idea.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's cool to see those connections.
And this connects to AI, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like the Turing test.
Yeah, the Turing test is a great example of how this thinking evolved.
So how did Turing's work influence this?
Well, Turing was really interested in whether machines could think, right?
Yeah.
But he realized that the question of whether a machine could think was kind of tricky.
Yeah, I can see that.
So he shifted the focus to whether a machine could behave in a way that was indistinguishable from a thinking human.
So instead of looking at the insides of the machine, he said, let's just see what it does.
Exactly. He said, let's focus on the functional roles of those internal states.
I see, I see.
If a machine can hold a conversation that's as intelligent and engaging as a human's, then maybe, just maybe.
Maybe it's thinking.
Yeah, or at least doing something very similar.
That's pretty cool.
Right. It's a powerful thought experiment.
It is.
And it really influenced the development of functionalism.
This all sounds kind of similar to behaviorism, though.
Ah, good point.
Didn't behaviorists also focus on, what you could observe?
Yeah, but there's this key difference.
Okay.
Behaviorism, at least in its more hardcore forms,
Right.
it tried to explain everything in terms of stimulus and response.
Like a simple input-output.
Exactly. It ignored what was happening inside the mind.
Interesting. So behaviorism was all about the external stuff,
Pretty much.
whereas functionalism is saying, hold on, there's more going on inside.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of internal processing that we need to account for.
Makes sense.
Functionalism recognizes that there are internal states.
Like beliefs and desires.
Yeah, all those things that play a crucial role.
But how do they define these internal states?
They define them by their functional roles, by how they relate to other internal states, to inputs, to outputs.
Okay, so it's not enough to just look at the behavior.
Right, we need to look under the hood.
We need to understand those mental gears.
Exactly.
But the article mentions different types of functionalism, like machine state functionalism,
Uh-huh.
analytic functionalism,
Yeah.
and psychofunctionalism.
Right, there are a lot of flavors of functionalism.
Can you break those down for us?
Sure.
What are the key differences between these approaches?
Well, let's start with machine state functionalism, which really leans into that computer analogy.
Okay, so is this like saying our brains are just biological computers?
Well, It's a helpful analogy, but we have to be careful.
Right, of course.
Machine state functionalism proposes that mental states are analogous to the different states of a Turing machine.
Hmm.
Each state defined by its role in processing inputs, generating outputs, and transitioning to other states.
So it's like a complex flowchart,
Yeah, think of it like that.
where each mental state leads to another based on the inputs and the current state of the system.
Exactly. It's about mapping out the flow of mental states.
Okay, I can see that. But I imagine there are limits to how far you can push that computer analogy.
You're absolutely right.
Our brains are a little more complex than that, I think.
A little bit, yeah.
Right.
While machine state functionalism is a clear framework,
Yeah.
it does face some challenges,
Like what?
like accounting for the richness and complexity of human experience,
Okay.
especially those fuzzy subjective qualities we call qualia,
Oh, right. Qualia.
like the feeling of pain or the experience of seeing red.
Those are tough ones.
Yeah, those are hard to define in purely functional terms.
I see. So that's where analytic functionalism and psychofunctionalism come in.
Right, they offer different ways of defining mental states.
All right, let's dive into those next time then.
Sounds good.
What are analytic functionalism and psychofunctionalism all about?
Well, we'll have to wait and see.
Ooh, a cliffhanger.
Stay tuned.
I'm intrigued.
We'll pick up the thread in part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, listener. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear more.
I'm looking forward to it.
We'll be back soon to tackle those thorny issues and explore how functionalism grapples with the mysteries of subjective experience.
Indeed, we'll be getting into some really interesting stuff.
So until next time, keep those brain cells firing.
And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss part 2.
See you soon.
Bye for now. Welcome back to our deep dive into functionalism.
All right, so last time we left off,
Yeah,
we were about to tackle those tricky experiential states.
right, the qualia problem.
Yeah, those subjective experiences that are so hard to pin down.
Like the feeling of pain or the experience of seeing red.
Exactly. It's like, how do you explain that in terms of functional roles?
Well, it's one of the big challenges for functionalism.
Yeah, because if it's all about inputs, outputs, relationships,
Right.
how do we capture what it's like to actually have those experiences?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
One strategy that functionalists use is the idea of quality spaces.
Quality spaces. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Think of it like a map of all possible experiences within a certain sense modality, like vision or touch.
Okay, so like a map of all the colors I could see or all the textures I could feel.
Exactly. The quality space for color would include all the different shades and hues we can perceive.
And where does the feeling of redness fit into all of this?
Good question. So redness would be defined by its location on this color map, its relationship to other colors, and by the typical behaviors and reactions it evokes.
So instead of trying to describe what it feels like to see red,
Right.
we're defining it by its place in a network of relationships.
Exactly. It's about grounding those subjective experiences in a framework of relationships and potential behaviors.
So it's like saying, it's closer to orange than blue. It often evokes feelings of warmth or excitement, and it makes people stop at traffic lights.
That's a good way to put it.
Clever. But even if we can map out this quality space, can we really be sure that everyone experiences these qualities the same way?
That's a big question.
Like, what if my red is your green, but we've both learned to call it red?
That's the inverted qualia problem?
Yeah, the possibility of qualia inversion is a real head-scratcher.
It's a major challenge for functionalism, especially the analytic kind.
Because if two people can be functionally identical, but have totally different subjective experiences,
Yeah.
then it seems like something is missing from the functionalist story.
Right. It seems like function alone can't capture everything about consciousness.
So even if we can explain how the mental machinery works,
Uh-huh.
we still don't know what it's like to be that machine.
It's like we can describe the gears turning, but we don't know what it feels like to be a gear.
That's a great analogy.
It really gets at the heart of the issue.
Maybe psychofunctionalism, with its focus on actual brain processes,
Yeah.
can help us with this problem.
Well, it's tempting to think that neuroscience can solve the qualia mystery,
Right.
but it's not that simple.
How so?
Even with detailed brain scans, we can't directly access someone's subjective experience.
We can see the brain activity, but we don't know what it feels like to be that brain.
Exactly. It's like trying to understand a book just by looking at the cover.
That makes sense.
We need to get inside the story to really understand it.
Speaking of getting inside, the article mentions another interesting thought experiment.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of absent qualia.
Ah, the absent qualia objection. That's a fun one.
Yeah, the possibility of having a system that's functionally identical to a human being, but with no subjective experience.
Like a philosophical
I
zombie.
go through the motions,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
with no inner world.
The classic example is Bloch's Chinese nation thought experiment.
Oh, yeah, the one with all the people in China acting like a brain.
Exactly. Imagine the entire population of China working together as a giant brain.
It's a wild idea.
They're receiving inputs, processing information, generating outputs.
But they don't experience anything.
The argument is that this Chinese nation wouldn't have any qualia.
So it's like a complex machine that mimics human behavior perfectly, but doesn't actually feel or experience anything.
Right. It's functionally equivalent, but subjectively empty.
That's a pretty big challenge for functionalism.
It certainly is.
If a system can be functionally equivalent to a human, but lack qualia,
Yeah.
then function alone can't be the whole story.
It seems like something is missing.
So how do functionalists respond to this? Do they just deny that zombies are possible?
Well, some do argue that the Chinese nation scenario is just not realistic.
Like it's too complex to ever actually happen?
Yeah, they might say it's beyond our current understanding and technological capabilities.
Okay, so they're saying, don't worry about the zombies, they're not coming for your qualia. But what about the functionalists who take the zombie threat more seriously?
Well, they might concede that zombies are conceivable,
Okay.
but they'll argue that conceivability doesn't necessarily equal possibility.
So just because we can imagine something doesn't mean it could actually exist.
Right, our intuitions about what's possible can be flawed.
Like imagining a square circle.
Exactly.
It's logically impossible,
You're right.
even if we can picture it in our minds.
There might be other reasons to think that zombies can't exist, even if we can imagine them.
Okay, I see their point.
It's a subtle but important distinction.
It is.
But even if we set aside the zombies for now,
Okay.
there's still the issue of the explanatory gap.
Ah, right, the gap between physical processes and subjective experience.
Can functionalism really bridge that gap?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is, even if we can meticulously describe the functional role of pain.
Yeah.
Does that really tell us what it feels like to experience pain?
Right, it's like I can tell you all about the physics of fire.
The chemical reactions, the heat, the light.
Yeah, but that wouldn't capture what it feels like to get burned.
It wouldn't give you the first-person experience.
So is functionalism doomed to fall short when it comes to qualia?
Well, functionalists have different strategies for addressing this challenge.
What are some of those strategies?
One approach is to appeal to the idea of phenomenal concepts.
Phenomenal concepts, okay.
The idea is that our understanding of qualia is fundamentally different from our understanding of physical properties.
Interesting, how so?
It's like this. Knowing what it's like to experience red isn't about grasping some objective fact about the world.
Okay.
It's about having a certain kind of first-person experiential access.
So you don't really understand redness until you've seen it.
Exactly. It's not just about knowing facts. It's about having that direct experience.
Like you can read all about swimming, but you don't really understand it until you jump in the water.
That's a great analogy.
It's about having that firsthand encounter.
Right.
But how does this help functionalism explain qualia?
The idea is that phenomenal concepts can refer to functional or physical states without needing to introduce some extra mysterious qualia property.
So it's a way to say that the feeling of redness is the activation of certain neural pathways.
Right, but we grasp this identity through our first-person phenomenal concept of redness.
So it's like saying, yes, redness is a physical process, but we understand it in a special way because we've experienced it.
Exactly.
It's a clever move.
It is.
But I imagine not everyone is convinced by this phenomenal concept approach.
You're right, there are definitely critics.
What do they say?
They might argue that it's just a fancy way of dodging the hard problem of consciousness.
Like it doesn't really explain how physical processes give rise to subjective experience in the first place.
That's their main objection.
It's like, even if we have a special word for magic, that doesn't make magic real.
The mystery still remains.
So is this where the eliminativists come in?
Ah, you're getting it.
They say, actually, qualia don't exist, it's all just an illusion.
Exactly. Eliminativism is a radical position, but it's gaining popularity.
So it's like saying, we used to think the sun revolved around the earth, but then we learned better.
And eliminativists think the same thing will happen with qualia.
We'll realize it was a flawed concept all along.
That's the idea.
That's a bold claim.
It is, but it's one that some philosophers take very seriously.
I mean, it's Hard to wrap your head around the idea that your feelings aren't real.
It's a counterintuitive idea, for sure.
But hey, maybe the eliminativists are onto something?
Maybe.
Maybe we're all just highly sophisticated robots, blissfully unaware of our lack of qualia.
That's a thought-provoking possibility.
It is.
But even if eliminativism is wrong, the challenges it raises have been really productive for functionalism.
How so?
It's forced functionalists to refine and defend their theories in more sophisticated ways.
So it's been good for the debate overall.
Exactly. It's pushed the field forward.
Makes sense. Philosophical push-ups are always good for the mind.
That's a good way to put it.
But before we get too lost in the existential void,
Right.
the article mentions some other objections to functionalism.
Oh, yes, there are more.
Things like holism and mental causation.
Those are big ones.
We haven't even touched on how functionalism explains how our mental states can cause things to happen in the physical world.
Right. The problem of mental causation.
And then there's the question of introspection, how we know about our own mental states.
That's another challenge for functionalism.
Seems like we've got a lot more to unpack.
We do. There's still much to explore.
Well, I think our listener's brain is probably starting to feel a bit like that overstimulated Chinese nation by now.
Maybe it's time for a mental reboot.
I agree. Let's give our listener a moment to process all of this.
Take a deep breath.
And we'll be back soon for part 3.
Looking forward to it.
We'll delve into those further objections to functionalism.
We'll see if it can withstand the pressure.
Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into functionalism. It's the final part.
The final part, yes.
So far, we've gone through like the basic principles of functionalism, and we've looked at some really big challenges.
Yeah, we've encountered some pretty mind-bending objections.
Qualia, zombies, the whole shebang.
A whole shebang, yeah.
But the journey doesn't end there.
Nope, there's still more to explore.
So what else do we need to consider?
Well, we've talked about how tricky it is to define those experiential states like qualia in purely functional terms.
Right.
But there are also objections that question the very foundation of functionalism.
Okay, like what? What are those foundational objections?
Well, let's start with the problem of holism.
Holism, okay.
So functionalism defines mental states by their relationships to other mental states, inputs, outputs.
Right, we talked about that.
And this creates a web of interdependence.
A web of interdependence, okay.
That some philosophers find problematic.
How so?
Well, it's like saying to understand what it means to believe it's raining.
Yeah.
You need to understand what it means to want to stay dry. And to understand that, you need to understand what it means to fear getting wet.
So it's like a chain reaction.
Exactly. It becomes a never-ending chain of interconnected mental states.
And that's a problem for functionalism.
Well, it raises concerns about how we can ever really isolate and define individual mental states.
I see, because if everything is so interconnected, how do we even begin to build a functionalist theory?
It's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle.
Okay.
Where every piece is constantly changing shape.
That does sound tricky.
It is, and it's a challenge that functionalists have to address.
So what do? Do they just give up?
No, not at all. They've come up with some clever strategies.
Like what?
Well, some functionalists try to identify core defining subsets of mental states that are less entangled with the rest.
So they're looking for like the fundamental building blocks.
Exactly. They're trying to find a more stable foundation for the theory.
But that sounds really difficult.
It is. It's an ongoing debate within functionalism.
Right. Because how do you even decide which mental states are the core ones?
That's the tricky part.
So holism is one hurdle for functionalism.
Yeah.
What's next?
Well, let's move on to mental causation.
Mental causation, right?
This one's a real brain twister.
Okay, I'm ready.
It's the question of how mental states, which are defined in terms of their functional roles, can actually cause things to happen in the physical world.
Yeah, this is something I've always struggled with.
I can see why.
It feels like my desire for coffee causes me to get up and make a cup.
Right.
But if my desire is just a functional state, a pattern of brain activity, how can it cause anything physical?
That's the challenge, right?
It's like, isn't it just the neurons firing that are doing the real work?
That's what some people argue.
So where does that leave mental states?
Right. Are they just passive bystanders?
Or do they have real causal powers?
It's a big question.
It seems like we have this strong intuition that our thoughts and feelings cause our actions.
Right. We feel like they're in the driver's seat.
But then we have this picture of the world as a physical system.
Governed by physical laws.
So how do we reconcile those two perspectives?
Well, functionalists have a few different responses to this problem.
Like what?
Some argue that we need a broader understanding of causation,
Okay.
one that goes beyond that traditional picture of physical events bumping into each other.
So not just billiard balls.
Right. They might say that mental causation is a kind of higher level causation,
Higher level causation.
operating on a different level than the physical.
But still having real effects.
Exactly. It's a different kind of causation.
So it's like the queen's move in chess.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
It doesn't physically push the pawn across the board,
Right.
but it still influences the game.
It has a causal influence, even if it's not direct physical contact.
Right. Okay, I like that analogy.
It helps to illustrate the point.
It does.
Now, other functionalists try to explain mental causation by appealing to the relationship between the functional role and the physical realization of a mental state.
So they're bringing those two things together.
Exactly. They might say that the physical state, like the neurons firing, is what actually causes the action.
Okay.
But it does so because it's realizing a particular functional role, like the desire for coffee.
So the physical state is doing the work, but the functional role is giving it meaning.
Right. It's like saying that the metal key is what actually unlocks the door.
But it does so because it has the right shape to be a key.
Exactly. The functional role and the physical realization are intertwined.
And that's how mental causation works.
That's one way to look at it.
Interesting. So we've talked about holism and mental causation.
Yeah, those are two big challenges.
Are there any other big objections to functionalism we should cover?
Well, we should probably talk about introspection.
Introspection, right? How we know our own thoughts and
It
feelings.
seems so straightforward.
Yeah, it feels like I just know what I'm thinking and feeling.
Right. You don't need to observe your behavior or anything.
It's just there, directly accessible.
But this actually poses some interesting challenges for functionalism.
How so?
Because functionalism is all about explaining mental states in terms of their functional roles.
Yeah.
So how do you fit introspection into that framework?
Right. It's like introspection doesn't seem to need a functional explanation.
Exactly. So some functionalists try to reconcile introspection with their theory by suggesting that self-awareness is itself a kind of functional state.
So it's like having an inner observer in our minds.
That's one way to think about it.
But doesn't that just create another problem?
What do you mean?
Well, how does this inner observer gain introspective access?
Ah, you're right. It can seem a bit like a homunculus fallacy.
Explaining one mystery with another mystery.
Exactly. So other functionalists take a different approach.
What do?
They argue that the immediacy of introspective belief arises from the close functional connection between the mental state itself and our belief about that state.
So it's like the pain itself is wired to create the belief that you're in pain.
Exactly. It's built into the functional system.
That sounds more elegant.
It does, but it still leaves some questions unanswered.
Like how that wiring actually works.
Yeah, and how it gives rise to that feeling of awareness.
Right, so functionalism has some explaining to do there.
It does.
But overall, it's been a wild ride exploring these ideas.
It has. Functionalism is a really fascinating theory.
It is. It's given us a lot to think about.
And it's still a very active area of research and debate.
Well, I think our listeners probably had a good mental workout today.
They probably need another reboot.
They do. But we've reached the end of our deep dive into functionalism.
Sad to see it end.
Me too. But hopefully our listener has come away with a deeper understanding of this really complex and important theory of mind.
Yeah, and maybe even some new questions to ponder.
Always good to have more questions.
Keep those philosophical gears turning.
And thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Until next time.